Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. What's lurking in the Appalachian woods at night? Something that copies your voice, something that hides underground, something that doesn't want you to leave. Tonight, I've got 8 bone-chilling camping stories that actually happened. People who went into those mountains and barely made it out alive. Some of their friends weren't so lucky. Fair warning, you might want to keep the lights on for this one. Before we dive into the darkness, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Share this with someone who loves scary stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Ready? Let's begin with story number 1. I was 28 when this happened, working as a dental hygienist in Richmond and slowly losing my mind from dealing with people's problems all day, every day. 8 years of staring into mouths, listening to complaints, pretending to care about insurance copays. I was getting mean, snapping at patients over nothing. My coworker Jessica could see I was heading for a breakdown. She'd grown up doing wilderness camping with her scout troop in southwestern Virginia, always talking about how the mountains could reset your whole perspective on life. "There's this place my old scout leader took us," she said one Tuesday, cornering me in the break room. "Echo Lake, up in the Jefferson National Forest. You have to hike 7 miles through some of the roughest terrain in Virginia to get there, but it's completely untouched. No cell service, no people, just pure wilderness." The way she described it, this hidden mirror of water surrounded by ancient peaks, accessible only to those willing to earn it, sounded like exactly what my burned-out brain needed. We'd both done car camping at state parks before, the kind where you drive up to a numbered spot and use actual bathrooms, but this would be different. Real backcountry camping, where you carry everything you need and depend on yourself completely. Jessica spent the week before our trip methodically checking her gear. Her father's Vietnam-era Army surplus backpack, a 3-season tent that had weathered dozens of mountain storms, water purification tablets, and this old fishing kit that belonged to her grandfather. I borrowed what I could from friends and bought the rest at a military surplus store in Mechanicsville, including a sleeping bag that smelled like mothballs and a backpack that was probably older than I was. The drive took 3.5 hours, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until we reached what Jessica swore was the right trailhead. It wasn't much, just a small gravel pullout where the Forest Service road dead-ended, with a weathered wooden sign so faded you could barely make out Echo Lake Trail, 7.2 miles carved into the wood. An additional, smaller sign warned, "Backcountry camping permit required, no facilities." No rescue services beyond this point. The trail started deceptively easy, a wide path through mixed hardwood forest that made me think Jessica had oversold the difficulty. But after the first mile, it turned into what felt like a punishment designed by sadists. Steep switchbacks that seemed to double back on themselves endlessly. Loose rock that shifted under your feet, and roots positioned perfectly to catch your toes and send you sprawling. My borrowed backpack felt like it gained 5 pounds every mile, and by the 4th mile I was seriously considering turning back. "This is insane." "Jess," I gasped during one of our water breaks. "How did you do this as a kid?" "We were in better shape then," she laughed, but I could see she was working harder than she'd expected too. "And we had our scout leader, Mrs. Henderson. She was this tiny woman, maybe 65 years old, but she could hike circles around teenagers. She used to tell us stories about the old families who lived back in these hollows before the Forest Service took over the land. Said, some places in these mountains still remember things from before. The last 2 miles were the worst, a relentless climb that had us stopping every few hundred yards to catch our breath. But when we finally crested the final ridge and saw Echo Lake spread out below us, I understood immediately why people made this brutal journey. The lake was a perfect oval of water, so still it looked like polished obsidian, reflecting the surrounding peaks with impossible clarity. Ancient hemlocks and white pines crowded right to the water's edge, except for one small area, a crescent of sandy beach, maybe 50 feet wide, that was clearly the only place anyone could camp. "Jesus," I breathed, staring down at it. "It's like it's not even real." "Mrs. Henderson used to say the Cherokee considered this a sacred place," Jessica said, shouldering her pack for the final descent. "They called it the Watching Water. Had stories about spirits that lived in the depths and would show you things if you knew how to look." We made camp on that little beach as the sun was setting, and I have to admit, Jessica had been right about this. being exactly what I needed. The silence was extraordinary. Not just quiet, but a complete absence of the constant background noise that follows you everywhere in civilization. No traffic, no air conditioning, no electrical hum, nothing. Just the soft whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional call of a loon from across the water. That first night, we managed to catch 2 small brook trout using Jessica's grandfather's fly rod and cooking them over our campfire while stars reflected in the perfectly still water made me feel more accomplished than anything I'd done in months. The lake never moved, not even when strong wind came through the trees around us, maintaining that mirror-like surface that made the whole place feel suspended outside normal time. My grandmother used to fish this lake when she was young, Jessica said as we sat by the fire. This was before the trail got so overgrown, back when families still lived in these mountains. She said the water was different from other lakes, older somehow, said it reflected more than just what was on the surface. The second morning started perfectly normal. We woke to mist rising off the water like smoke, made coffee with our camp stove, and planned our day. Jessica went down to the water's edge to brush her teeth and wash her face while I organized our gear. I was stuffing sleeping bags when I heard her call my name in this strange, confused voice. When I looked over, she was crouched by the water, staring down at her reflection with her toothbrush frozen halfway to her mouth. "Maya, come look at this," she said, and something in her tone made me drop everything and walk over. Her reflection was brushing its teeth too, but with the opposite hand, like you'd expect from a normal mirror. "That's how mirrors work, Jess," I started to say. But then she raised her left hand to wave at me. Her reflection raised its left hand too, same side, not mirrored. We both laughed nervously about it. "Weird optical illusion," Jessica said, but she kept staring at the water like she was trying to figure out a puzzle. "Must be the angle of the morning light or something." Later that afternoon, while Jessica was setting up her fishing gear, I decided to test the depth. I picked up a smooth stone about the size of a golf ball and threw it toward the center of the lake, expecting to hear it hit bottom, or at least see how the ripples spread. The splash happened in slow motion. I watched the stone hit the water and saw ripples start spreading outward in perfect concentric circles. Then they just stopped. About 3 feet from the impact point, the ripples froze like someone had paused a video, perfect circular lines sitting motionless on the surface, while the water around them remained mirror smooth. After maybe 10 seconds, the ripples didn't fade. They just vanished, like they'd never existed. "Did you see that?" I called to Jessica, but she was focused on her fishing line and just shrugged. I threw another stone, smaller this time. Same thing. Splash, expanding ripples, sudden stop, then nothing. No sound of the stone hitting bottom, no waves reaching shore, like the lake was swallowing the energy somehow. That's when I started paying closer attention to other things that seemed off. There were no insects on the water surface, despite being surrounded by forest. No fish jumping, even though Jessica was getting bites. And the temperature, despite being a mountain lake in early October, the water felt almost warm when you put your hand in it. Around 4 o'clock, I was reading in my camp chair when I saw Jessica standing waist-deep in the water about 30 yards from shore. She had her back to me and seemed to be just standing there, perfectly motionless. It struck me as odd because Jessica was always moving, always doing something. "Jess," I called out, "what are you doing out there?" Jessica's voice answered from directly behind me. "What do you mean? I'm right here." I spun around, and there was Jessica, sitting at our camp table organizing her tackle box. When I looked back toward the water, the figure was turning around slowly. It had Jessica's face, her hair, even the same t-shirt she'd worn that morning. But the eyes were wrong. Completely black, like looking into deep water at night. It smiled and waved at me with Jessica's exact gesture, then sank straight down without any splash or ripples, just disappeared beneath the surface like it had never been there. "Jess," I said carefully, my heart starting to pound, "were you just in the water?" She looked up from her tackle box, confused. "No, I've been sitting here for the last 20 minutes. "Why?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, but it sounded insane even to me. Jessica came over, and we both stared out at the water, which had returned to its perfect mirror surface, reflecting nothing but sky and clouds. "Maybe it was a trick of the light," she said, but I could see she was unsettled too. "These mountain lakes can play tricks on you. Mrs. Henderson used to warn us about that." That night, we heard splashing coming from the lake around 11 o'clock. At first, I thought maybe a deer had come down to drink, but then I heard laughter, our own laughter, mine and Jessica's, echoing across the water. We unzipped the tent flap and looked out to see perfect copies of ourselves swimming and playing in the moonlit water. They looked exactly like us, down to the smallest detail. Same hair, same camping clothes, same mannerisms, but they moved with this fluid grace that seemed too perfect, like dancers who'd rehearsed every gesture. The water Jessica was doing backstrokes, while the water Maya floated on her back, both of them giggling and talking in voices that carried perfectly across the still air. "Maya, come swim with us," my own voice called across the water. "The water's perfect. So warm." Jessica started walking toward the water like she was sleepwalking, a dreamy smile on her face. "Yeah," she said softly. "The water does look nice." I grabbed her arm. "Jess, stop. That's not right." But she kept trying to walk forward, not fighting me exactly, but pulling with this gentle, insistent pressure like she was being drawn by invisible strings. In the water, our doubles were waving and beckoning, calling our names in perfectly reproduced voices. "Come on, don't you want to swim? We're having so much fun. Come be with us." I managed to pull Jessica back to our tent, but she spent the rest of the night staring out at the water through the mesh window, watching our doubles swim and play, and have what looked like the most wonderful time imaginable. Every so often, one of them would surface near our shore and call softly, "Jessica, Maya, we're waiting for you." "They look so happy," Jessica murmured around 3 in the morning. "Don't they look happy?" I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept watching those things that wore our faces, trying to figure out what they were, what they wanted. They never seemed to get tired, just kept swimming and diving and having conversations I couldn't quite hear. Sometimes they'd surface and stare directly at our tent, pointing and gesturing like they were making plans. The third morning, I woke up soaked to the bone. Not just damp from condensation, but drenched like I'd been swimming in my clothes. My sleeping bag was dry underneath me, but I was completely wet from head to toe, and my hair smelled like lake water. Jessica was gone from her sleeping bag. I found her standing at the water's edge, having what looked like a perfectly normal conversation with her reflection. Both versions were nodding and gesturing, like old friends catching up on gossip. When I called her name, they both turned to look at me simultaneously, and that's when I saw Jessica's eyes had changed. They were starting to turn black from the outside in, with dark tendrils spreading inward like ink bleeding through water. Not completely black yet, but getting there. And when she smiled at me, it was with that same fluid perfection I'd seen in the water doubles. "Maya," she said in a voice that sounded like Jessica but felt hollow underneath. "You should come talk to your friend. She's been waiting for you." Looking down into the crystal clear water, I could see something that made my blood turn to ice. There was Jessica, the real Jessica, 15 feet below the surface, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hair floating around her face as she clawed frantically at the water above her head. She was trying to swim up but couldn't move, like something was anchoring her to the bottom. The thing wearing Jessica's face grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like ice water. "Don't you want to be happy, Maya? Don't you want to be with your best friend forever?" Her grip was impossibly strong, and those darkening eyes reflected nothing. I tried to pull away, but she was dragging me toward the water with inhuman strength. "We can all be together now. No more work, no more problems, just swimming and laughing and being happy forever." Behind us, I heard more voices, my own voice calling from multiple directions. "Maya, come back to us. We love you. We're your family now. Just come swimming with us." I managed to break free by digging my heels into the sand and throwing my full weight backward. The Jessica thing stumbled, and I ran for my backpack, grabbing only the essentials. Water, my keys, my wallet. Every reflective surface I passed showed water versions of myself reaching out, trying to grab me as I went by. The tent windows, Jessica's sunglasses, even puddles from the morning dew. I ran those 7 miles without stopping once. Behind me, I could hear splashing footsteps following me up the trail, like someone running through ankle-deep water, even though we were on dry mountain path. The voices multiplied as I climbed, dozens of Jessicas and Mayas calling my name, promising fun and friendship and eternal happiness if I'd just come back and join them. Every time I glanced back, I caught glimpses of movement between the trees, figures that looked like Jessica and me following parallel to the trail, but never quite visible enough to focus on. They stayed with me for the first 5 miles, their voices echoing through the forest, before finally fading as I reached higher ground. When I got back to my car, I sat in the driver's seat, shaking for 20 minutes before I could get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the Forest Service station and told them Jessica was missing, that she'd fallen in the lake and I couldn't find her. They sent a search and rescue team back to Echo Lake that same afternoon. They found our campsite exactly as we'd left it, 2 tents, all our gear, even the fish we'd caught still wrapped in leaves by the cold ashes of our campfire. But Jessica's body was never recovered. The divers said the lake was only 18 feet deep at its deepest point, crystal clear all the way to the bottom. They could see everything down there, fallen trees, old camping gear that had been lost over the decades, even the stones I'd thrown to test the depth. But no Jessica. It's impossible, the lead diver told me. Someone can't just disappear in water that's shallow and clear. We can see every inch of that bottom. They dragged the lake 3 times and brought in sonar equipment. The search went on for 5 days before they finally called it off, listing Jessica as a missing person presumed dead. Her family held a memorial service 2 weeks later. I was the only one who knew what really happened, and there was no way to explain it that wouldn't get me committed. I still see Jessica sometimes, usually in mirrors or windows when I'm not expecting it. Her mouth is always open, like she's trying to scream, trying to warn me about something urgent. The black has completely taken over her eyes now, but she still looks like she's fighting, like some part of the real Jessica is still trapped down there, trying to get out. I moved away from Virginia 6 months later, couldn't handle being anywhere near those mountains. I don't camp anymore, don't even like being near large bodies of water. Sometimes I'll catch myself at a public pool or a lake and have to leave immediately when I see my reflection looking back at me from the surface. The worst part is the dreams. 2 or 3 times a week, I dream I'm back at Echo Lake, and Jessica is calling to me from the water. She sounds so happy, so carefree, just like she used to. "Maya, come swimming, the water's so warm, all our friends are here." And every time, I take a step closer to the water's edge. Because part of me wants that happiness she's offering, wants to stop feeling guilty about leaving her behind. I wake up soaked in lake water some mornings, even though I live in Phoenix now, hundreds of miles from the nearest natural lake. My bathroom mirror fogs up in patterns that look like ripples spreading across water. And late at night, when the house is quiet, I can hear my own voice calling to me from somewhere far away. "Maya, come back to us. We're still waiting for you." I've never told anyone this story before. Not the whole truth. The police report just says Jessica fell in the lake and drowned, that the current must have carried her body away somehow. But I know she's still down there in that perfect, terrible water, and I know that someday, those things wearing our faces are going to find someone else willing to make that 7-mile hike to Echo Lake. If you're reading this and thinking about visiting that place, don't. Whatever's in that water has been there long before the Cherokee called it sacred, long before the first settlers came to these mountains. It's patient, and it's hungry, and it knows exactly how to make you want to join it. The happiness it offers is real. I could see it in Jessica's face as she sank beneath that mirror surface. But it's the kind of happiness you can never leave, the kind that keeps you 17 feet underwater forever, screaming warnings that no one will ever hear. I was 19 when this happened, working double shifts at the Walmart in Sylva, North Carolina, trying to save up enough to move out of my dad's trailer. Dad had been writing me all summer about being soft, saying I wouldn't last a day doing what his people used to do, hunting, trapping, living off the land in these mountains. It stung because his family had been in western North Carolina for 5 generations, back when they still called it the Cherokee homeland. And here I was, his son, afraid to sleep outside without a nightlight. When deer season opened that November, I decided I'd prove him wrong. I'd been saving every spare dollar for 6 months to buy real camping gear. Not the cheap stuff from the sporting goods section where I worked, but proper mountain equipment from the outfitters in Asheville. Dad suggested Devil's Backbone Ridge, up in the Pisgah National Forest, where his daddy used to hunt back in the 50s, before the government bought most of the land for conservation. There were still a few primitive camping areas if you hiked far enough in, and Dad figured it would test whether I had any mountain blood left in me. The old-timers around Sylva had stories about Devil's Backbone. My grandmother used to say the Cherokee wouldn't hunt there, that they had names for things in those woods that didn't translate to English. When the loggers came through in the 20s, they'd find camps abandoned overnight, coffee still warm in the cups. Dad always said it was just bear country, that people spooked easy when they got too far from civilization. But I'd grown up hearing whispers about hunters who went in and came out different, if they came out at all. I loaded my Honda Civic with everything I thought I'd need. Down sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, 4-season tent, camp stove, enough food for 3 days. Dad made me take one of his old hunting knives and promised to wear bright orange the whole time since it was opening weekend. The drive up took me through some of the most beautiful country in North Carolina, past apple orchards and Christmas tree farms, into mountains so old they'd been ground down to gentle curves by millions of years of weather. The trailhead was nothing more than a rutted dirt pullout marked by a weathered wooden sign that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the Carter administration. Below the official Forest Service information, someone had carved "Things Live Here" in shaky letters, the wood around it stained dark like old blood. I figured it was just locals trying to scare off outsiders, the kind of thing mountain people did to keep their hunting spots secret. The trail started easy enough, winding through second-growth forest thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel. These weren't the ancient trees you'd find deeper in the mountains, but they were old enough to block out most of the afternoon sun, creating a green twilight that made everything feel hushed and cathedral quiet. The air smelled like pine needles and moss, that clean mountain smell that you can't get anywhere else. About 2 miles in, I found the old logging road Dad had told me to look for. It was mostly grown over now, just 2 parallel tire ruts with young poplars growing between them, but it was still easier walking than the main trail. The road climbed steadily through stands of old oak and hickory, trees that had probably been saplings when my great-grandfather first hunted these ridges with a single-shot rifle and whatever he could carry in his pockets. That hike was harder than I'd expected. I was in decent shape from working on my feet all day, but hauling 40 pounds of gear straight uphill for 4 miles left me winded and questioning my decision to prove anything. By the time I reached the old camping area, the sun was hanging low over the western ridges and the temperature was dropping fast. November in the mountains doesn't mess around. It can be 60 degrees in the afternoon and below freezing by midnight. I found the perfect spot in a small clearing surrounded by massive white pines, with a creek running along one side that sang over smooth river rocks worn down by centuries of mountain water. Best of all, there was still an old tree stand built into a giant oak at the edge of the clearing. It was weathered gray and covered with lichen, but solid enough that it could have been there since my grandfather's time. Just seeing it there made me feel connected to something bigger than myself, like I was carrying on a family tradition that went back generations. That first evening, setting up camp by headlamp, I felt incredibly proud of what I'd accomplished. 19 years old, alone in wilderness that had tested mountain men for centuries, completely self-sufficient with gear I'd bought with my own money. I cooked instant mac and cheese on my camping stove and sat by my small fire watching stars appear through the pine canopy, listening to the sounds of the mountains settling in for night. The forest was alive with the normal sounds of opening weekend. Distant gunshots echoing across the valleys, deer moving through the brush somewhere downhill, the occasional rumble of a pickup truck on some far-off logging road. An owl called from somewhere across the creek, and another answered from deeper in the woods. It felt exactly like I'd imagined real mountain camping would be, like I was finally becoming the kind of person my family had always been. I slept hard that first night, better than I had in months. Something about being that far from civilization, breathing air that clean, knowing I'd proven I belonged in these mountains. The temperature dropped to maybe 30 degrees, but my sleeping bag kept me warm, and I woke up around dawn feeling like I could stay up there forever. The second morning started perfect. I made coffee and oatmeal on my camp stove, watching the sun burn off the mist rising from the creek, listening to birds waking up in the canopy above. The air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe, sharp and sweet with the smell of pine sap and mountain laurel. I was thinking about maybe extending my trip an extra day when I heard the first gunshots. 3 shots, spaced exactly 30 seconds apart. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hunters were everywhere during opening weekend, and everyone had their own patterns and rituals. But as I sat there drinking my coffee, something about the timing bothered me. It was too perfect, too mechanical. Real hunters don't shoot on a stopwatch. They wait for the right moment, the right shot, the right animal. These sounded like someone was following a schedule. Over the next hour, I kept hearing those same perfectly timed shots, always in groups of 3, always 30 seconds apart. And they seemed to be coming from wherever I was thinking about hiking that day. When I'd consider heading north toward the main ridge, I'd hear the shots from the north. When I'd think about exploring the old logging roads to the east, the shots would start up from that direction. Like something was tracking my thoughts and positioning itself accordingly. Around 10 in the morning, I was refilling my water bottles from the creek when I heard my grandfather's voice calling from the thick woods across the clearing. "Riley, big buck over here." Clear as day, like he was standing 50 yards away trying to get my attention without spooking the deer. But Grandpa had been dead for 5 years. I'd helped carry his casket at the funeral, had watched them lower him into the red clay soil of the cemetery behind the Baptist church in Silva, and his voice was definitely coming from deep in the forest, from a direction where the rhododendron grew so thick you couldn't walk through it without a machete. I stood there, frozen, water bottle in my hand, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. The voice came again, a little farther away this time, fading like someone walking deeper into the woods. "Riley, come help me track this one." It sounded exactly like Grandpa, same excited tone he'd always gotten when he found fresh deer sign, same way he'd whisper shout to keep from spooking game. My rational mind knew it was impossible, but my feet started moving toward the voice anyway, like I was hypnotized or sleepwalking. I pushed through the thick undergrowth, following what sounded like Grandpa's voice leading me deeper into the woods. The rhododendron branches caught at my jacket and scratched my face, and the ground was covered with a thick carpet of leaves that had been accumulating for decades, muffling every sound except my own breathing. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. The trees were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no insects buzzing. Even the air felt different, thicker somehow, like breathing through wet wool. The temperature seemed to drop with every step, even though I was moving and should have been warming up. And there was a smell underneath the normal forest scents, something metallic and sour that made my stomach turn. About 100 yards into the woods, I found a crude tree stand that definitely hadn't been there the day before when I'd scouted the area. It was built into an old maple tree that looked half dead, just some weathered boards and rusty nails hammered together like someone had thrown it up in a hurry. But it looked old, like it had been weathering for decades, and the wood was stained dark with what might have been blood or rust or something worse. When I looked up at the stand, I could see someone sitting in it, a hunter in full camouflage watching me through the scope of a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. Even from 60 feet away, I could tell something was wrong with how still he was sitting. Real people sway a little bit, shift their weight, blink their eyes. This figure was motionless as a statue, like he'd been carved from wood and positioned there. I waved, figuring it was just another hunter who'd hiked in early that morning and maybe found a good spot to watch the deer trails. The figure waved back with his free hand, but kept the rifle pointed directly at my chest, the scope never wavering even when he moved his arm. The hair on the back of my neck started standing up, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. I called up to him, asking if he'd seen any deer sign, but he didn't answer. Just kept watching me through that scope. Rifle barrel tracking my movement as I shifted nervously from foot to foot. I could feel his attention on me like a physical weight, could sense him studying me the way a predator studies prey. The silence stretched out until I couldn't take it anymore, and I backed away slowly until I couldn't see the tree stand anymore, then practically ran back to my campsite. The rest of that afternoon, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe there had been a hunter in the woods, and I'd just gotten spooked because I was alone and jumpy. Maybe the voice had been someone else calling to their hunting partner, and I'd misheard the name because I was thinking about Grandpa. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard, and it had definitely been my grandfather's voice calling my name from somewhere no living person could have reached. I spent the afternoon trying to stay busy around camp, organizing my gear, filtering more water than I needed, checking and rechecking my equipment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked up at the tree line, I expected to see that motionless figure with the rifle, and every sound from the woods made me jump. The normal forest sounds had changed too. No more bird calls, no squirrels chattering, just an unnatural silence that felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. As the sun started setting behind the western ridges, painting the sky the color of old blood, a hunter stumbled into my campsite asking for help. He was bleeding from his chest, dark stains spreading across a hunting jacket that looked like it belonged in a museum. The whole outfit was wrong. Heavy wool coat, canvas pants, leather boots that looked like they'd walked through decades of mountain mud. And the smell hit me before he even got close, like gun oil and decay and something sweet and rotten that made my eyes water. "Got myself turned around out here," he said, pressing one hand against the wound in his chest. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well, hollow and distant. "Been bleeding like this since dawn. You got any medical supplies?" I did have a first aid kit, and I started to get it out of my pack, but when I looked closer at the wound, my hands froze. It wasn't bleeding right. Instead of red blood, there was this thick black substance seeping through his fingers, more like motor oil than anything that should come out of a person. And the edges of the wound looked old, like they'd been there for years instead of hours, the flesh around them gray and starting to curl. "You need a hospital," I told him, my voice coming out higher than I wanted. "This is way beyond what I can do with a first aid kit." That's when he smiled at me, and my world tilted sideways. His teeth weren't right. Every single one of them had been filed down to sharp points, yellowed with age, and shaped like the fangs of some predator. When he smiled, black liquid dripped from the corners of his mouth, and I could smell his breath, like meat that had been left out in the sun for weeks. "Been hunting these woods for 70 years, he said, that awful smile never leaving his face. "Never seen prey quite like you before." The word hit me like a physical blow. Prey. Not a hunter like you or a person like you, prey. Something to be stalked and killed and dragged back to wherever this thing made its home. He was carrying a rifle that looked like it had been pulled out of a Civil War battlefield, all rust and cracked wood held together with wire and what might have been human hair. But he handled it like it weighed nothing, like it was an extension of his body. Every few minutes, he'd work the bolt with a sound like breaking bones and point it at shadows around the campsite, tracking things I couldn't see, with movements that were too smooth, too precise for anything human. "What's your name?" I asked, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. He tilted his head like he was considering the question, and when he moved, I heard his neck creak like old leather. "I'm still hunting," he said finally, and the way he said it made it clear that wasn't his name, it was what he was. Not someone who hunted for sport or food, but something that existed only to hunt, that had been hunting since before my grandfather was born. I started thinking about how to get out of there. But my car was 4 miles away, down a trail I'd barely be able to follow in daylight, much less in the dark. Running through the woods at night seemed like exactly what this thing would want me to do. Chase me through the trees like the prey it thought I was, probably the same thing it had been doing to hunters for generations. The temperature was dropping fast now that the sun was down, and my breath was starting to come out in visible puffs. But the thing sitting by my fire didn't seem affected by the cold at all. It just sat there watching me, with eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's, that awful smile never changing, never blinking, never looking away. Around midnight, when the cold had settled into my bones, and I was starting to think about retreating into my tent, it stood up in one fluid motion that no human being could have managed. Time for the real hunt to begin. It walked into the woods making deer calls, but they were perfect in a way that made my skin crawl. Too exact, too practiced, like it had been making those sounds for longer than deer had been living in these mountains. And they worked. Within minutes, I could hear deer responding, walking past my campsite toward those calls with steady, deliberate footsteps that sounded wrong. Deer are cautious animals, always alert, always ready to bolt. These sounded like they were sleepwalking. Then came the sounds that still wake me up at night 6 years later. Gunshots followed by screaming that was definitely, absolutely human. Not the quick death cry of an animal, but prolonged human screaming, full of terror and agony and the kind of desperation that comes from knowing you're about to die in the worst possible way. It went on for minutes, echoing across the valleys, and I knew there weren't supposed to be any other people within miles of where I was camping. "Riley." The voice was calling my name now, coming from the direction of the screaming. But it wasn't the thing's voice anymore. It was my father's voice, then my grandfather's, then my own voice calling back to itself like an echo. "Come help me with this big one, biggest buck I've ever seen." I broke down my campsite faster than I'd ever done anything in my life, hands shaking so bad I could barely work the tent stakes loose from the frozen ground. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it was using the voices of everyone I'd ever cared about to lure me deeper into the woods where it could do to me whatever it had done to whoever was screaming. I shouldered my pack and started down the old logging road in the dark, using my headlamp to navigate around fallen trees and washouts that hadn't been there on the hike up. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, always getting closer, no matter how fast I moved. The thing was breathing loud enough for me to hear. Wet, rattling sounds like its lungs were full of fluid, punctuated by that horrible clicking noise it made when it worked the bolt of its rifle. Riley, it was cycling through every voice it had collected over the decades, men and women and children, all of them calling my name with increasing desperation. "Don't leave us here. The hunt's not over. We need your help." 2 miles from my car, stumbling through the dark with my headlamp failing and my legs shaking from exhaustion and terror, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of running all the way to the parking area where I'd be trapped if the thing caught up, I stopped and decided to face whatever was hunting me. I was 19 and stupid and tired of being afraid, and some part of me that came from 5 generations of mountain people figured it was better to fight than to let this thing chase me home to my family. I turned around with my hunting knife ready, and there it was, 15 feet away, in the dying beam of my headlamp. The hunter, but wrong in every conceivable way. Its face was decomposing now, skin hanging in strips from bones that looked more animal than human. Those filed teeth were still grinning at me, but now I could see that its mouth went back too far, stretching almost to where its ears should have been. The rifle was raised and pointed at my chest, and I could hear it humming some old mountain ballad in a voice like grinding glass. "You're not running anymore," it said through what was left of its throat. "Good. Been so long since I had prey that fought back. Makes the meat taste better." When it fired, I threw myself behind the biggest tree I could find, and the bullet took off a chunk of bark so close to my head that I could feel splinters hit my face. The smell of gunpowder mixed with that rotten sweet stench that followed the thing everywhere, and I could hear it working the bolt again, getting ready for another shot. I waited until I heard its footsteps getting closer, then charged around the tree with my knife, ready. When the blade hit its chest, the thing didn't bleed. It just fell apart, like it was made of smoke and shadows, dissolving into black mist that smelled like burned hair and old bones. For a second, I thought I'd won, thought I'd actually killed it, but the mist swirled back together 20 feet away, and there it was again, rifle raised, that impossible smile stretching across its ruined face. 70 years, it wheezed. 70 years I've been waiting for prey that knows how to fight. I ran the final miles to my car harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through branches that tore at my clothes and stumbling over roots that tried to trip me in the dark. My lungs burned in the cold air, and I could taste blood from where I'd bitten my tongue. But I kept running because I could hear that thing behind me, always, just a few steps back, humming that awful song and working the bolt of its rifle like a metronome. When I finally reached the parking area, I fumbled with my keys so badly it took 3 tries to get the car started. As I was backing out, spinning tires on the gravel, and trying not to think about what would happen if the engine died, my headlights swept across the tree line one last time. There it was, standing at the edge of the woods, waving goodbye with its free hand while the rifle stayed pointed at my car. It was smiling, that terrible smile, and even though I was already moving, I could hear it calling my name in my grandfather's voice, promising that it would be waiting if I ever came back. I drove straight home without stopping, not even for gas, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds and jumping every time headlights appeared behind me. When I got back to Dad's trailer at 4 in the morning, shaking and covered in scratches and reeking of fear sweat, he took one look at me and knew something terrible had happened. I told him everything, expecting him to think I'd lost my mind or gotten into some bad weed. Instead, he just nodded and said Grandpa had mentioned strange things happening on Devil's Backbone Ridge, hunters who went missing or came back changed, but he'd never given any details. Said the Cherokee had warned the first white settlers about something in those woods, something that had been hunting long before humans came to these mountains, but most folks figured it was just stories meant to keep outsiders away from the good hunting grounds. That was 6 years ago. I never went camping alone again, never went hunting, never even went hiking without at least 2 other people with me and enough firepower to stop a bear. I moved to Asheville, where the mountains are just something pretty you see in the distance, and I work in an office now, processing insurance claims in a building where the closest thing to wilderness is the parking lot. Every hunting season, when the leaves start turning and the air gets that sharp edge that means winter's coming, I think about that thing still up there on Devil's Backbone Ridge, waiting for the next hunter who wants to prove they belong in those mountains. I think about all the people who've gone missing over the years in the national forest, all the disappearances that get blamed on bears or getting lost or falling off cliffs. I still have the nightmares, especially when November comes around. Always the same dream. I'm back in those woods, and I can hear it calling my name in voices I recognize, telling me there's the biggest buck anyone's ever seen just over the next ridge. In the dream, I always start walking toward the voices, even though I know what's waiting for me. I wake up in a cold sweat with my heart pounding, and for just a second, I can smell gun oil and decay, like it's still out there somewhere, still hunting, still adding new voices to its collection. Sometimes I wonder if it's still using my grandfather's voice to call to hunters in those woods. If someday some kid like me will hear a familiar voice leading them deeper into the forest where something that's been hunting for 70 years is waiting with an ancient rifle and teeth filed to points, I hope whoever it is runs faster than I did, and I hope they never look back. Because looking back now, I know I got lucky. I know that thing let me go for reasons I'll never understand, and I know better than to test that luck twice. The mountains will always be there, older than human memory, keeping their secrets in the shadows between the trees. And some secrets are better left alone. I'm Frank Morrison, 47 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years investigating storm damage for Nationwide Insurance. When you've seen enough twisted metal and houses split in half by tornadoes, you start thinking you understand how weather works. That confidence nearly cost me and my daughter our lives in the Tennessee mountains 3 summers ago. Emma had just turned 23 and was getting married that October. She wanted one last camping trip together, just father and daughter, before everything changed forever. "Dad, look at this place," she said, showing me her laptop screen one evening. "Wildcat Meadow. It's supposed to have the most incredible views in the Smokies, and the camping looks perfect for us." The photos showed exactly what we both loved. An open meadow surrounded by forested peaks, with a clear mountain stream cutting right through the middle. The online reviews were glowing. "Hidden gem, perfect for experienced campers. Views that will change your life." What struck me as odd, even then, was that none of the reviews mentioned specific weather conditions. For a place that beautiful, you'd expect people to talk about perfect sunny days or dramatic storms they'd witnessed. I'd been teaching Emma wilderness skills since she could walk. Every summer, growing up, we'd spend at least 1 week in the mountains, the Smokies, Blue Ridge, sometimes as far as the Adirondacks. She knew how to read weather patterns, set up camp in wind and rain, navigate by compass when GPS failed. At 23, she was a better outdoorswoman than most people I knew with decades of experience. The forecast that week showed 3 days of clear skies with temperatures in the low 80s. Perfect conditions for what Emma kept calling our last adventure as just the two of us. I checked multiple weather services, even called the ranger station. Everyone agreed. Stable high-pressure system, no chance of precipitation, gentle winds from the southwest. The kind of forecast that makes insurance adjusters like me relax, knowing we won't be getting storm damage calls. We drove up on a Thursday morning in my Ford F-150, the truck bed loaded with our gear. Emma had bought herself new hiking boots and a technical pack for the trip. Excited to test them out. The drive took us deeper into the mountains than I'd been in years, past abandoned mining camps and forgotten settlements that were just names on old maps now. The last 20 miles were on Forest Service roads that hadn't been maintained in seasons. The trailhead sat at the end of a gravel road that probably hadn't seen traffic in weeks. No other vehicles, no ranger station, no cell service. Exactly the kind of remote location Emma and I preferred. The hike to Wildcat Meadow was 3 miles through dense hardwood forest, following a stream that chattered over moss-covered rocks. Emma handled the trail like the experienced hiker I'd trained her to be, maintaining a steady pace even with a full pack. The meadow exceeded every promise the photos had made. 2 acres of natural grassland, surrounded by peaks that rose like cathedral walls, with the clearest mountain stream I'd ever seen running straight through the center. Ancient oaks dotted the edges where forest met meadow, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that shouldn't have existed at this elevation. Something about those trees bothered me, but I couldn't place what. We set up our tent about 50 yards from the water, following all the wilderness protocols I'd drilled into Emma over the years. Bear safety, leave no trace principles, camp kitchen, away from sleeping area. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. That first evening, we cooked dinner on our camp stove and talked about her upcoming marriage to Marcus, her plans for the future, how strange it felt that she was really an adult now. "I'm going to miss this," Emma said as darkness settled around us. "Just us, no complications, no wedding stress. Marcus doesn't really get the camping thing. He'll learn," I told her. "Or, you'll find other ways to get your mountain time." The stars that night were incredible. No light pollution for 50 miles in any direction meant we could see the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Emma fell asleep first, and I stayed awake longer than I should have, just enjoying the peace and feeling grateful for moments like this with my daughter before her life really started. I woke up the second morning to rain pounding our tent. Heavy, driving rain like you get with severe thunderstorms, the kind that sends me out on damage assessments. But when I unzipped the tent flap to check our gear, brilliant sunshine was streaming down into the meadow. Blue sky stretched from horizon to horizon, not a cloud anywhere visible. "Dad?" Emma's voice was thick with sleep and confusion. "What's that sound?" I stuck my entire upper body outside the tent. Rain was absolutely hammering the fabric above us, but I was sitting in bright, warm sunshine. Emma crawled over and held her hand outside. She felt the cold raindrops while standing in weather that was clearly 75 degrees and sunny. In 20 years of adjusting weather damage claims, I documented hail the size of grapefruits, tornadoes that carved mile-wide paths through neighborhoods, ice storms that brought down power grids across 3 states. But I'd never seen a 10-foot rain cloud that targeted a single tent. The meteorological impossibility of it made my stomach clench with the first real fear I'd felt in years. "This doesn't make sense," Emma said, stating the obvious. "Rain doesn't fall from clear skies." We decided to relocate our campsite. Packed everything up methodically, carried our gear 50 yards toward the tree line, and set up again in a different spot. The rain cloud moved with us. Not gradually, not following wind patterns. It shifted position instantly, like it was tethered to our location by invisible cables. The temperature under our personal storm dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The rain felt ice cold, like it was falling from much higher altitude than any normal cloud formation could reach. Emma started shivering despite the warm sunshine just 5 feet away. Other hikers passed through the meadow during the day. I counted 4 different groups heading to peaks further up the trail. They walked through perfect weather, looking at us like we were insane, standing under a localized downpour that didn't exist for them. I tried documenting the phenomenon with my camera. Every photo showed clear skies. Video recording captured sunshine and our voices, but no sound of rain. Whatever was happening to us wasn't registering on any electronic device. Emma suggested calling for help, but our phones had no signal anyway. Besides, what would we tell emergency services? That we were being stalked by weather? "Dad," Emma said around noon, her voice tight with growing fear. "This isn't stopping. It's been raining on us for 4 hours straight." That afternoon, wind started battering our tent. Violent gusts that flattened the walls and bent the support poles at angles they weren't designed to handle. But when Emma stood outside, her hair didn't move. The trees surrounding the meadow were perfectly still, their leaves hanging motionless in the calm air. Inside our tent, we were experiencing what felt like sustained 50-mile-per-hour winds. The sound was wrong. Wind doesn't scream like that, doesn't carry voices mixed in with the howling. Human voices, clear as conversation, saying, "Leave," and "Not welcome," and "Go away now." Emma heard them too. She grabbed my arm and said, "Dad, something's talking to us through the wind." Lightning started at 4 in the afternoon, but there still weren't any storm clouds anywhere in the visible sky. The strikes hit in perfect geometric patterns around our campsite, exact 30-foot circles with our tent at the center. Each bolt hit precisely where one of us had been standing moments before, like something was tracking our movements and learning our patterns. The strikes came every few minutes with mechanical regularity. Each one hit ground we'd just vacated, always missing us by seconds. After the 5th near miss, I realized we weren't dealing with random lightning. Something was using electrical storms as a targeting system. Then snow began falling. Heavy, wet flakes in July, in Tennessee, while the temperature outside our weather bubble held steady at 82 degrees. Emma stood 5 feet from our tent in shorts and a tank top, sweat beading on her forehead from the heat, while snow piled up 6 inches deep on our tent fly. "Dad," Emma said, her voice shaking now, "this isn't natural weather, something's hunting us." I had to agree. 2 decades of storm damage investigation had taught me every weather pattern that occurred naturally in this region. What we were experiencing violated every law of meteorology I knew. Rain doesn't fall from clear skies. Snow doesn't happen in summer heat. Lightning doesn't strike in geometric patterns from cloudless blue sky. "We need to leave," I told her. "Right now." But as soon as I spoke those words, fog began rolling in. Thick, gray fog so dense we couldn't see our own hands, but only around our immediate campsite. I could look up and see stars appearing in the darkening sky overhead, and when I walked 20 feet in any direction, the air cleared completely. The fog bank had sharp, defined edges, like someone had drawn a circle around us with supernatural weather. Voices started calling from the mist. Sarah's voice, calling Emma's name, even though my ex-wife was 3 hours away in Nashville. Emma heard her grandmother, Margaret, who'd been dead for 6 years, telling her to come into the fog, that she had something wonderful to show her. The voices sounded exactly right, perfectly mimicked, except they were coming from directions that made no sense. "Emma, honey, come here to Grandma Maggie," the voice called from the mist. "I've been waiting so long to see you." Emma took 3 steps toward the voice before I caught her arm. Her eyes were unfocused, dreamy, like she was sleepwalking. "That's really her voice, Dad. That's exactly how she used to call me." The fog started forming shapes. Human silhouettes reaching toward us with arms that stretched too long, faces that looked almost right but moved wrong, full figures that beckoned us deeper into the white. They had mass, substance, but they flowed like liquid when they moved. Emma was hyperventilating, saying the mountain itself wanted us dead. Hail began falling then, baseball-sized chunks of ice that should have knocked us unconscious. But they only hit our tent, and each piece left dents in the fabric that formed letters. When enough had fallen, the dents clearly spelled "Leave Now" across our rainfly in perfect block letters. That's when I understood. This wasn't weather at all. This was something ancient, using meteorological phenomena as communication, as weapons, as tools to drive us away from territory it considered its own. I started packing our gear in near total darkness, working by feel, while Emma helped. Both of us moved with desperate efficiency, stuffing sleeping bags and clothes into our packs without regard for organization. Rain, snow, hail, lightning, and tornado-force winds were all happening simultaneously now in a space maybe 20 feet across. I'd given up trying to understand it. I just wanted to get my daughter off this mountain alive. As we shouldered our packs and stumbled toward where the trail should be, every type of weather intensified. It was like walking through the concentrated fury of multiple storms that had been compressed into a supernatural killing zone. The hail was drawing blood through our rain gear. Lightning strikes were close enough that I could taste metal in the air after each bolt. Emma couldn't maintain her footing in the chaos. I put her on my back in a fireman's carry and stumbled blindly toward the trail marker I'd memorized that morning. She was crying, telling me she was sorry for picking this place. Like any of this was her fault. The storm followed us step for step, a spotlight of pure meteorological violence that moved with us as we walked. Trees were exploding around us from lightning strikes. Massive oaks that had stood for centuries split down to their roots in showers of sparks and splinters. The wind was strong enough to lift us both off the ground for seconds at a time. Hailstones, the size of softballs, were leaving craters in the earth where they hit. I found the wooden trail marker by running into it face first in the dark. My nose started bleeding, but I'd never been happier to feel pain in my life. It meant we'd found the way out. I carried Emma down that trail for 2 miles, through conditions that should have killed us both, my legs shaking from exhaustion and terror, but never stopping, never slowing down. The supernatural storm followed us for the first mile, then began to fade as we descended. By the time we reached the parking lot, I could hear normal night sounds. Crickets, owls, the distant call of a whippoorwill. Real weather, behaving according to natural laws. When I finally looked back toward Wildcat Meadow from beside our truck, I could see our personal tornado still raging in the distance. A column of impossible weather reaching from the meadow to the clear night sky, spinning in place like a malevolent lighthouse beacon. Emma saw it too. We sat in the truck for 30 minutes with the engine running and the doors locked, just staring at proof that something in those mountains could control weather itself. The drive home took 3 hours. Neither of us spoke until we were back in civilization, passing the first 24-hour gas station we'd seen. Emma finally broke the silence. "Dad, what was that thing up there?" "I don't know," I told her. "But I know it wanted us gone, and it had the power to kill us if we'd stayed." Emma still talks about that camping trip, but now she calls it the night Dad saved my life. Marcus, her husband, doesn't really believe our story. He thinks we're exaggerating what was probably just a freak storm system. But Emma and I know what hunted us in Wildcat Meadow. I've adjusted thousands of storm damage claims since then. Tornado damage, hurricane destruction, hail impacts that totaled entire shopping centers. I know natural weather patterns better than most meteorologists. What happened to us wasn't natural. Something that's lived in those mountains longer than humans have walked. This continent doesn't want visitors in its territory. I never file reports for impossible weather anymore when I investigate claims. If someone calls in damage that doesn't match any known weather pattern, I mark it down as cause undetermined and close the file. Because I learned that summer that there are entities in the Appalachian wilderness that can weaponize storms, and they don't care about our scientific explanations. Emma got married that October. Beautiful ceremony, perfect weather. But when she and Marcus planned their honeymoon, Emma specifically requested a beach resort with room service and a spa. "I'm done with mountains for a while," she told him. "Maybe forever." I never went back to the Tennessee mountains. I've driven past that Forest Service road twice when work took me through the area, but I never turn off the highway. I can see Wildcat Meadow from the main road if I know where to look, just a small clearing surrounded by peaks that rise like cathedral walls. It looks peaceful from a distance, but I know what's waiting up there for anyone foolish enough to camp under the open sky. To this day, Emma gets anxiety attacks when weather changes suddenly. If we're having dinner and a thunderstorm rolls through without warning, she'll stop talking mid-sentence and listen to the rain with this haunted expression, like she's checking to make sure the storm sounds normal, that it's following the rules weather is supposed to follow. I don't blame her. Once you've been hunted by something that can turn the sky itself into a weapon, every storm feels personal. Every roll of thunder sounds like it might be calling your name. And sometimes, on nights when the weather turns violent without warning, I wonder if that thing in Wildcat Meadow remembers us too. I'm 31 years old, and I work as an elementary school teacher here in North Carolina. I've always been the type who keeps people together. It's just my nature, I guess. When you spend your days making sure 20-something third graders don't lose their minds, you get pretty good at organizing things and making sure everyone's taken care of. That's probably why I was the one who decided to plan our college reunion camping trip. 5 of us from State University hadn't seen each other in 8 years. Not since graduation. Life just gets in the way, you know? Marcus became an accountant down in Charlotte. Jenny's been working as an ER nurse in Raleigh. Dave opened his own auto shop back home, and Lisa moved to Asheville doing graphic design. We'd kept in touch through Facebook and the occasional text, but it wasn't the same. I figured we needed to get together before we all got too busy with marriages and kids and mortgages. All that grown-up stuff that makes it harder to just pack up and go camping like we used to do in college. I spent weeks researching places where we could have a group campsite. Raven's Nest Campground, up in the Virginia mountains, seemed perfect. They allowed group camping, had decent facilities for those of us who weren't exactly wilderness experts anymore, and it was far enough away from everything that we could really disconnect. The pictures online showed these beautiful wooded sites with fire rings already set up, and the reviews were mostly positive. A few people mentioned it being quiet and isolated, which sounded perfect to me. I handled all the planning because that's what I do. I bought a big camp stove for group cooking, made sure everyone had the right gear lists, coordinated who was bringing what food. Marcus was supposed to handle drinks. Jenny brought the first aid kit since she's the nurse. Dave said he'd take care of firewood, and Lisa volunteered for breakfast stuff. I had spreadsheets for everything: meal plans, packing lists, driving directions. My friends used to tease me about being so organized, but they always appreciated it when everything went smoothly. The campground was about 3 hours from Raleigh, up winding mountain roads that got narrower the higher we climbed. I remember thinking it was exactly the kind of place we'd have loved as college students, remote enough to feel like an adventure, but not so far out that we'd die if something went wrong. The trees were thick on both sides of the road, mostly oak and maple with some pine mixed in, and you could smell that clean mountain air even with the car windows up. When we all arrived that Friday evening in October, it felt like no time had passed since graduation. Marcus still told the same terrible jokes. Jenny still laughed at everything. Dave was still the practical one, checking everyone's tire pressure. And Lisa was already taking pictures of everything for Instagram. The campsite was perfect, a clearing surrounded by tall trees with a stone fire ring right in the center. I watched everyone set up their tents in a circle around the fire pit, exactly like I'd envisioned when I was planning the trip. That first night was everything I'd hoped for. We cooked hot dogs and made s'mores, shared stories about our jobs and dating lives, caught up on all the college friends we'd lost touch with. Dave had brought his guitar and played some of the old songs we used to sing at parties. The fire crackled and popped the way campfires are supposed to, throwing orange light on everyone's faces. I felt so proud of myself for putting this together, for being the one who made sure we all stayed connected. This was exactly what we needed. The campground was mostly empty. We'd seen maybe 2 other sites occupied when we drove in, both down near the entrance road. Our site was way up at the end of the loop, probably a quarter mile from the nearest neighbors. The camp host had mentioned that October was usually pretty quiet, especially on weekdays, and that we'd probably have the whole upper section to ourselves. That sounded perfect to me. We could be as loud as we wanted without bothering anyone. The second evening is when I first noticed something was off with our fire. I'd been camping plenty of times before, both as a kid with my family and during college with this same group of friends. I knew what campfires were supposed to look like, how they were supposed to behave, but when Marcus got our Saturday night fire going, something was different. The flames were too bright, almost blindingly white instead of the warm orange we'd had the night before. And they were completely silent. No crackling, no popping, just this weird hissing sound, like air escaping from a tire. Is it just me, or does this fire look weird? I asked, squinting against the harsh white light. Marcus was adding another piece of wood, but when he did, the flames actually got smaller instead of bigger. We all stared at that for a moment, trying to figure out what we were seeing. Then, when he stopped feeding it and sat back down, the fire roared back to life, bigger than before, reaching almost 4 feet high. "That's not right," Dave said. He's always been the practical one, the guy who can fix anything mechanical. Fires don't work backwards like that. Lisa was sitting across from me, and I noticed her shadow wasn't behaving normally. None of our shadows were. They seemed to be reaching toward the fire independently, moving when we weren't moving, stretching in directions that didn't match where the light was coming from. I kept looking back and forth between Lisa and her shadow, trying to figure out what I was seeing wrong. Jenny, who's seen everything working in the ER, was the first to really voice what we were all thinking. "That fire looks hungry," she said quietly. "I know that sounds crazy, but look at it. It's like it's watching us." I tried to laugh it off, make some joke about spooky campfire stories, but my voice came out strained. Dave got up and grabbed the water jug from our cooking area. "Let's just put it out and start fresh," he said. "Maybe the wood's wet or something." When he poured the water on the flames, they hissed loudly and seemed to shrink, but they didn't go out. Within seconds, they were back to that unnatural white brightness, even hotter than before. The heat hit my face like opening an oven door. "What kind of fire doesn't go out when you pour water on it?" Marcus asked. He was trying to sound joking, but I could hear the nervousness in his voice. I should have insisted we extinguish it completely right then. I should have made everyone help me stamp it out and scatter the coals. But we were all mesmerized by it somehow, and nobody really wanted to be the one to ruin the evening by freaking out about a weird campfire. So, we left it burning and went to bed with that strange white light flickering through our tent walls. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of Marcus talking outside. His voice was different, faster, higher pitched, like he'd had too much caffeine. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. He was sitting by the fire, which was still burning with those silent white flames, talking rapidly to himself about how beautiful the fire was, how warm and perfect and alive it seemed. "Marcus?" I called softly. "You okay?" He turned to look at me, and his eyes were reflecting the firelight like an animal's would. Too bright, too intense. "Sarah, you should come sit by the fire. It's amazing out here. I've been watching it for hours, and it's like it's dancing just for me." "It's 3 a.m, I said. "Don't you think you should get some sleep?" "Sleep?" He laughed, but it didn't sound like his normal laugh. "Who needs sleep when you have fire like this? Come on, Sarah, come sit with me." Something about the way he said it made my stomach clench. I told him I was tired and zipped my tent back up. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I could hear him out there, talking to the fire in that strange, excited voice until dawn. By morning, Lisa was acting the same way Marcus had been. Hyperactive, talking too fast, eyes too bright. Jenny and Dave were getting snappy with each other over little things, arguing about where we'd put the coffee and who was supposed to bring sugar. Only I felt normal, and I was starting to feel like everyone else thought I was the problem. They spent the entire day gathering firewood with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Way more wood than we could ever use, dragging fallen branches from deep in the forest, stacking them in neat piles around our campsite. When I suggested maybe we had enough, they all looked at me like I'd said something offensive. "You can never have too much good wood," Dave said. But his voice had that same strange quality Marcus's had developed. "The fire needs to be fed properly." That evening, Marcus started our fire without matches or a lighter. He just sat there, rubbing 2 sticks together with manic focus until they suddenly burst into those silent white flames. I watched his hands moving in perfect rhythm, faster than should have been humanly possible, and those flames jumped to life like they'd been waiting for him. Jenny's eyes had started reflecting the firelight even during the day, like mirrors set in her face. When I mentioned that maybe we should take a break from campfires tonight, all 4 of them turned to stare at me in perfect unison. "Why would we want to do that?" Lisa asked, and the others nodded in agreement. "It's just, you all seem a little obsessed with the fire," I said carefully. "Maybe we could just talk tonight, or play cards, or something." They started speaking in harmony then, finishing each other's sentences about the fire's beauty and power, about how it was the best campfire they'd ever seen, about how lucky we were to have found such perfect flames. Their voices overlapped and echoed each other in a way that made my skin crawl. I realized then that something was seriously wrong. The fire was doing something to my friends, changing them somehow. And as the person who'd organized this trip, who'd brought them all here, I felt responsible for protecting them. That night, while they were off gathering more wood in the darkness, I tried to douse their fire with our entire water supply. I poured gallon after gallon on those white flames, but they just turned blue and burned even hotter. When my friends came running back with their arms full of wood, they were furious. "You're trying to kill it," Lisa screamed, and they surrounded me with their burning sticks like torches. "How could you try to hurt something so beautiful?" Dave's skin was actually hot to the touch when he grabbed my arm, and I could see sweat evaporating off him instantly in little puffs of steam. When I looked into Jenny's eyes, trying to reach my old roommate, my best friend from college, all I saw were those mirror-bright reflections staring back at me. They started whispering among themselves about how I was cold and didn't understand the fire's gift. They talked about me like I wasn't there, like I was some kind of obstacle they needed to deal with. I pretended to give in, told them I was sorry, that I understood now how special their fire was. I sat by the flames and nodded while they talked about how warm and alive and perfect it all felt. But inside, I was trying to figure out how to get them away from this thing that was consuming my friends from the inside out. Around midnight, I was lying in my sleeping bag trying to plan our escape when I heard footsteps surrounding my tent. I unzipped the flap and saw all 4 of them standing there, holding burning sticks, their faces lit from below by that harsh white light. "Time to join the fire?" "Sarah," Marcus said in a voice that didn't sound like him anymore. I grabbed our camp stove fuel canister and twisted off the cap. "If you want fire so badly, I'll give you fire," I said, holding it over my head. "I'll pour this all over myself, and we can all burn together." The sight of me with the fuel shocked them back to partial awareness. Jenny started crying, and for a moment I could see my friend behind those mirror eyes. "Sarah?" she said in her normal voice. "What's happening to us? The fire is killing you," I told them. "It's taking you away piece by piece, and you have to choose. Do you want the flames, or do you want our friendship?" Marcus looked back and forth between me and the fire for a long moment. Then he smiled, turned around, and walked directly into those white flames. He stood there burning, arms raised toward the sky, still smiling as the fire consumed his clothes and then his skin. He never screamed, never tried to get out. He just stood there, waving goodbye to us like he was going on vacation. The sight of Marcus burning snapped Jenny, Dave, and Lisa out of their trance. They started screaming, really screaming, and we all ran toward our cars together. I threw everyone's gear into the back of my SUV without bothering to pack it properly, and we drove down that mountain road faster than was safe, not stopping until we reached the main highway. Looking back, the entire campsite was engulfed in flames, but I swear I could still see Marcus standing in the middle of it all, still waving at us. I lost one friend that night, but I saved 3 others by refusing to give up on them. The fire department found no trace of Marcus or our campsite when they investigated. According to them, there hadn't been a fire on the mountain that night at all. Jenny, Dave, and Lisa don't remember much about what happened. They remember Marcus disappearing, but they think he just left in the middle of the night for some reason. I never told them the truth about what I saw. I still teach elementary school, and I'm still the one who organizes things and takes care of people. But I don't go camping anymore, and I sure don't trust any fire that burns too bright or too quiet. Sometimes, when I'm teaching my kids about fire safety, I remember Marcus standing in those flames, looking happier than I'd ever seen him in life. That's what teachers do, though. We protect the people in our care, even when they don't want to be protected, even when it costs us more than we thought we could afford to lose. I'm 24 years old and work as a veterinary technician in Asheville, North Carolina. Been doing it for 6 years now, ever since I graduated from the community college program. Working with animals teaches you things most people never think about, like how every species has its own language of sounds, movements, body language. After 6 years of listening to everything from injured hawks to sick farm dogs, I thought I knew every noise an animal could make in these mountains. Turns out I was wrong about that. My boyfriend Jake had been planning this camping trip to Crow's Peak for months. He'd been hiking those trails since he was 12, back when his scout troop would do their annual wilderness camping trips up there. Jake's one of those guys who knows every backwoods trail in western North Carolina, and he'd been promising me the best wildlife viewing in the state if we could just get a weekend free to make the trip. When I finally got promoted to lead tech at the clinic, he said that was reason enough to celebrate with a proper camping adventure. Jake's been into wildlife photography as a hobby for years now. Nothing professional, just takes his camera gear out on weekends and tries to get shots of black bears, wild turkeys, maybe catch a bobcat if he's lucky. He'd shown me pictures from previous trips to Crow's Peak. Deer families grazing in meadows, a red fox kit playing near a stream, even a black bear sow with cubs from a safe distance. The way he talked about it, the place was like some kind of wildlife sanctuary where animals felt comfortable enough to let humans observe them. We're both animal lovers, which is probably why we work so well together. Him with his photography, me with my professional training in animal behavior and biology. I'd spent years learning to read animal body language, understanding stress signals, recognizing illness or injury just from how an animal moved or vocalized. It was useful knowledge for more than just work, made me feel confident and safe in the outdoors, knowing I could interpret what the wildlife around me was doing. The hike to Crow's Peak took us about 4 hours, covering roughly 5 miles through some of the most beautiful old-growth forest I'd ever seen. Jake had mapped out the route weeks beforehand, planning stops at specific clearings where he'd had luck photographing black bears in previous years. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest, past rocky outcroppings and small waterfalls, eventually opening up into the meadow area where Jake's scout troop had always made camp. We set up our tent in the same clearing Jake remembered from his childhood trips, a roughly circular space surrounded by tall oaks and maples, with a small creek running along one edge. According to Jake, his troop had always seen deer here, especially in the early morning and evening hours when they'd come down to drink from the creek. perfect for wildlife photography and exactly the kind of peaceful setting I needed after the stress of my promotion and the extra responsibilities that came with it. That first evening went exactly like Jake had promised. We spotted a family of deer, a doe with 2 fawns, just as the sun was starting to set. I felt proud watching them, identifying their behaviors, explaining to Jake how the doe was positioning herself between us and her babies, how the fawns stayed close but kept looking to their mother for cues about whether we were a threat. Everything felt normal, familiar, exactly what I'd expect from healthy deer in their natural habitat. The forest was alive with all the usual sounds I knew by heart. Owls calling to each other once darkness fell, raccoons rustling through the underbrush looking for food, the occasional snap of a twig as some larger animal moved through the trees further away. I'd grown up spending time outdoors with my dad, and then my job had taught me to identify most of the nocturnal activity you'd hear in these mountains. Lying in our tent that first night, listening to the familiar symphony of night sounds, I felt completely at peace. The second morning changed everything. I woke up around dawn to the sound of a deer call that made my skin crawl. Technically, it was perfect. The exact pitch and rhythm of a white-tailed deer's contact call. But something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger at first. In 6 years of veterinary work, I'd heard deer make all kinds of vocalizations. Distress calls when they were injured, territorial sounds during rutting season, contact calls between family members. This sounded like a contact call, but there was a wet, throaty quality to it that I'd never heard before. Jake got excited, thinking it might be a big buck calling 24 in the area. He grabbed his camera gear and started trying to locate the source of the sound. That's when we both realized the call was coming from directly above us, somewhere up in the canopy of trees surrounding our campsite. Jake looked at me with confusion, and I felt my stomach drop. Deer don't climb trees. Whatever was making that deer sound was at least 30 feet off the ground. I could hear something large moving through the branches above us, but the movement was all wrong too. It was too fluid, too controlled. When deer move through thick brush on the ground, there's a certain rhythm to it. They step carefully, pause to listen, move again. This thing moved through the treetops like it belonged there, like it had been doing it for years. Around noon, while Jake was down at the creek, washing dishes, I heard my own voice calling from the woods. "Jake, come here. I need to show you something." Clear as day, in my exact tone and speech pattern. But I was standing right there by our tent, and the voice was coming from the tree line about 50 yards away. My throat went dry and I felt my hands start to shake. Jake came running back from the creek, asking what I needed, and I had to explain that I hadn't called him. We both stood there, staring at the spot where the voice had come from, but there was nothing to see except dense forest. Jake suggested maybe it was an echo of some kind, or another camper whose voice had carried further than expected. I wanted to believe that, but I knew what I'd heard. It was my voice, coming from something standing in those trees, watching us. That afternoon, Jake decided to glass the surrounding area with his binoculars, looking for wildlife to photograph. He'd been scanning the tree line for maybe 10 minutes when he suddenly went very still and handed me the binoculars without saying a word. He pointed toward a cluster of pine trees about 100 yards away and told me to look carefully. Through the binoculars, I saw what looked like a person crouched on all fours behind one of the pine trees. But the proportions were completely wrong. The limbs were too long for the torso, and the joints seemed to bend in ways that human anatomy doesn't allow. As I watched, it shifted its position, and I got a clearer view of the face. It looked almost human, 2 eyes, nose, mouth in the right places, but something about the features was fundamentally off. We watched it for several minutes, neither of us speaking. It seemed to be watching us back, turning its head at angles that made my neck hurt just thinking about it. Finally, it moved deeper into the trees and disappeared from view. Jake asked if I thought it might be someone who was injured or lost, but I couldn't get past how wrong the movement had looked. Every instinct I developed working with animals was telling me that whatever we'd seen wasn't human. Late that afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Jake walked into our campsite. The real Jake was still down at the creek, about 50 yards away, taking photographs of some interesting rock formations. I could see him through the trees, crouched beside the water with his camera. So when Jake walked up to me from the opposite direction and said hello, my brain took several seconds to process what was happening. This Jake looked right. Same height, same build, same clothes he'd been wearing all day. But he moved wrong. His joints seemed too flexible, and he held his head tilted at an unnatural angle when he spoke. As a vet tech, I'd studied enough mammalian anatomy to know that humans don't move the way this thing was moving. I decided to test it. I asked Jake what his middle name was, something only the real Jake would know. The thing smiled at me, but the smile was too wide. It had more teeth than a human mouth should hold, and they weren't quite the right shape. That's when I realized this wasn't Jake at all. The fake Jake's skin started shifting while I watched, like water moving under fabric. Patches of pale gray flesh became visible underneath what had looked like normal skin tone. It spoke again, but this time in my voice. Maria, come closer. I want to show you something. I watched its fingers elongate into claws while I stood there frozen. Its face began cycling through different features, sometimes Jake's face, sometimes mine, sometimes features I didn't recognize. The eyes stayed the same though, reflecting light like an animal's eyes, completely black with no visible whites. The real Jake returned from the creek and saw both of us standing there. For a long moment, all three of us just stared at each other. I had to decide which one was really my boyfriend, and I found myself studying details I'd never consciously noticed before. The way Jake's left shoulder sat slightly higher than his right, a small scar on his knuckle from a childhood accident, the exact way he shifted his weight when he was confused or nervous. The real Jake started asking what was going on, using speech patterns and references that matched 6 months of conversations and shared experiences. The fake Jake just stood there smiling, that too wide smile, apparently unable to mimic Jake's personality or memories, just his physical appearance. When I stepped toward the real Jake, the shapeshifter melted back into the forest without making a sound. That night was the longest night of my life. Multiple versions of ourselves surrounded our campsite after dark. I counted 3 different Mariahs with varying hair lengths and facial features, 2 Jakes with eyes that reflected our flashlight beam like an animal's. They called to us in perfect imitations of our voices, but the words didn't match our normal speech patterns. It was like listening to a recording of yourself played back at the wrong speed. Through our tent wall, I heard my mother's voice calling the childhood nickname that only she ever used, but when I unzipped the tent flap to look out, it was my own face speaking in my mother's voice. The mouth movements didn't match the sounds coming out, like watching a badly dubbed movie. Jake saw his dead brother walking around the perimeter of our campsite. But the brother had Jake's current haircut and was wearing clothes identical to what Jake had on. The thing was studying us, learning our forms, but it couldn't perfect the details. It was like watching someone try to draw a picture from memory, recognizable, but obviously wrong. I remembered something from my veterinary training about predator behavior. Animals that rely on mimicry are usually ambush predators, not used to direct confrontation. They depend on confusion and stealth, not strength. Instead of cowering in our tent, I decided to stand up and make myself look larger, staring directly at the main shapeshifter. It hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know about how to handle this situation. I started making loud, aggressive noises, not human sounds, but the territorial calls of large predators. Mountain lion screams, bear woofs, the kind of sounds that tell other animals to back off or face a fight. Jake caught on and joined me, and together we advanced on the creature, making as much noise as possible. The shapeshifter's copied human face melted away completely, revealing something that looked ancient and reptilian underneath. Something that had probably been in these mountains long before humans ever arrived. It retreated into the forest, but not before I got a clear look at its true form. Something that had evolved to hunt by deception, to study and copy and lure. We broke camp at first light and hiked out without stopping. Neither of us spoke much during the hike, but we both knew we'd experienced something that would change how we thought about the wilderness forever. Looking back now, 2 years later, I think we handled it about as well as anyone could. We trusted our instincts instead of trying to rationalize what couldn't be explained. We worked together instead of panicking separately, and we got out while we still could. Jake and I have been back to other parts of the Appalachian Mountains since then, but never to Crow's Peak. We carry air horns now when we camp, and we've learned to trust animal instincts over human appearance. Because sometimes the things that look most like us are the things we should trust the least. I still work as a veterinary technician, and I still love spending time outdoors. But I listen to the forest differently now. I know there are things in these mountains that have learned to wear our faces and speak with our voices. And I know that sometimes the best defense against something that hunts by deception is to stop trying to understand it and start making enough noise to let it know you're not easy prey. To this day, I've never heard another deer call that sounded quite like the one that woke me up that morning. And honestly, I hope I never do again. I'm 20 years old and I deliver pizza for Tony's in Charleston, West Virginia. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and I know every back road in 3 counties like the back of my hand. My buddy Marcus from high school had been bugging me for weeks about finding somewhere to camp for his 21st birthday, somewhere nobody else knew about, where we could drink some beers and not worry about park rangers or other people bothering us. That's when I remembered Devil's Hollow, this remote area about 2 hours east of the city where the old coal mines used to be. Locals avoid it completely, which I figured meant we'd have total privacy for the weekend. Marcus works construction and puts in 60-hour weeks when the weather's good. I'm pulling double shifts most days, trying to save up enough to maybe go to community college next year. We both needed to get away from our dead-end jobs for a while, just be stupid 20-somethings in the woods without any responsibilities. The plan was simple: pack light, hike in deep enough that we wouldn't see another soul, and spend 2 nights just relaxing by a campfire. I'd driven past Devil's Hollow plenty of times making deliveries to the mountain communities, but I'd never actually been down the old mining roads. The area got its name from this deep ravine that cuts through the hillside, where the coal companies blasted out huge sections of rock back in the 50s and 60s. When the mines played out and the companies pulled out, they left behind a maze of tunnels and access roads that nature was slowly reclaiming. The drive up took us through some of the most isolated country in West Virginia. We passed maybe 3 houses in the last 20 miles, all of them looking abandoned or close to it. The kind of places where people moved away when the work dried up and never came back. Marcus had brought his dad's old camping gear, a canvas tent that smelled like mothballs and a cooler full of cheap beer. I had my truck loaded with enough food for 3 days and all the firewood we could carry. The old mining road was barely more than 2 tire tracks carved into the hillside, overgrown with weeds and scattered with loose rocks. My truck's suspension groaned as we bounced through potholes that hadn't been filled in decades. About 5 miles up from the main highway, we found what looked like a perfect campsite, a flat area next to a stream, surrounded by thick woods and old mine entrances that had been sealed off with rusted metal plates. The whole area felt forgotten by time. Everywhere you looked, there were remnants of the mining operation. Concrete foundations where buildings used to stand, sections of railroad track disappearing into the forest, chunks of machinery so old and weathered you couldn't tell what they'd originally been for. But it was peaceful, too. The stream gurgled over smooth stones, and the afternoon sun filtered through the tree canopy in a way that made everything feel golden and calm. We set up camp about 50 yards from the nearest sealed mine entrance, close enough to the stream that we could hear the water but far enough back that we wouldn't have to worry about flooding if it rained. That first evening felt perfect. We built a huge fire, cooked hot dogs on sticks, and felt like kings of the mountain with nobody around for miles. The only sounds were normal forest noise and occasionally water dripping somewhere in the old mine shafts, probably from underground springs or runoff finding its way through cracks in the rock. Marcus was in great spirits, talking about how we should make this an annual tradition. Maybe bring some girls up here next time. I remember thinking this was exactly what we both needed. Just peace and quiet, and the feeling that the world had stopped spinning for a while. We stayed up late drinking beer and telling stories, and when we finally crawled into the tent around midnight, I fell asleep listening to the creek and feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The second morning started normal enough. I woke up around 8 when the sun hit the tent, and Marcus was already up poking at the embers of our fire. But while I was making coffee, I started hearing these scratching sounds coming from inside the sealed mine entrance nearest our camp. At first I thought it might be bats. These old mine shafts are full of them. But this was different. It was rhythmic, scratching, like something digging with tools rather than claws. Marcus said I was being paranoid, that it was probably just settling rock or small animals. But the sound continued on and off all morning. always coming from the same direction, always with that same deliberate rhythm. Around noon, I noticed something else. The ground under our tent was vibrating. Just subtle tremors, like machinery running somewhere underground. I pulled out my phone to check if there was any earthquake activity reported in the area, but there was nothing. No seismic activity anywhere in the region. That afternoon, something even stranger happened. I noticed our campfire was sinking. The ring of stones we'd built around it was slowly tilting inward, and the ground underneath was becoming hollow. When I poked the earth with a stick, it broke through into empty space. There was a tunnel, maybe 3 feet down, that we hadn't noticed before. The tunnel was perfectly round, about 4 feet in diameter, and the walls were too smooth to be natural. It looked like something had bored through the rock, leaving behind surfaces that were almost polished. From the hole came a smell I'll never forget. Wet concrete mixed with something organic that had been rotting in the dark for a very long time. Marcus came over to look, and we both just stared into this tunnel that definitely hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the ground had collapsed into an old mining tunnel. Maybe the vibrations we'd been feeling were the earth settling. But looking at those smooth walls, I knew no mining equipment had made that tunnel. As evening approached, we started seeing other holes opening up around our campsite. Not big ones, just cracks in the earth that weren't there before, like something was pushing up from underneath. The scratching sounds got louder, and now they were coming from multiple directions. Marcus wanted to pack up and leave, but it was getting dark, and I didn't trust myself to navigate those old mining roads in the pitch black. That's when we saw the hands. Pale fingers started reaching up through the cracks in the ground around our campsite. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the firelight, but Marcus saw them too. The fingers were too long and moved wrong, like they had extra joints or no bones at all. When Marcus grabbed my flashlight and shined it down one of the holes, something hissed and pulled back, but not before we got a good look at those hands. The skin was completely white, almost translucent, and the fingernails were black and way too long. The hands were attached to arms that seemed to stretch impossibly far underground. We'd see fingers emerge from a crack, feel around for a few seconds, then disappear back down into tunnels that had to extend for dozens of feet in every direction. It was like our campsite was sitting on top of a whole network of passages, and something was mapping the surface from below. Then a head emerged from our campfire pit. I can still see it perfectly when I close my eyes. Completely hairless, with skin so white it almost glowed in the firelight. But the worst part was the face. Where the eyes should have been, there were just black holes that went deeper than they should have. Its mouth opened too wide, showing teeth that were more like bone spikes, and it made clicking sounds like insects communicating with each other. Marcus and I froze. We just stood there watching this thing study us, tilting its head like it was trying to figure out what we were. Then more heads started emerging from different holes around our campsite, a whole colony of something that had been living in the mine tunnels probably for decades. They moved by flowing rather than crawling, like liquid taking human shape, and they all made those same clicking sounds back and forth to each other. The creatures started working together, tunneling new holes around us in what was obviously a coordinated effort to surround our campsite. I could hear them moving underground, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all converging on our location. The clicking sounds got more urgent, and the ground became increasingly unstable as they hollowed it out from below. That's when Marcus fell through. The earth just gave way under his feet, and he dropped into their tunnel network. I heard him screaming from underground, and without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and went down after him. The tunnel was just barely wide enough for a human to crawl through, and the walls were covered in some kind of slime that made everything slippery. The clicking sounds were coming from all directions now, echoing through passages that seemed to extend for miles under the mountain. I found Marcus about 30 feet from where he'd fallen, surrounded by 6 or 7 of the creatures. They weren't attacking him, they were studying him, touching his hair and clothes with fascination. When I appeared with the flashlight, they all turned those eyeless faces toward me and went completely silent. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then one of them reached out and touched my jacket with one of those impossibly long fingers. I realized these things had been isolated underground for so long they'd forgotten what surface dwellers looked like. They were curious about us, not hostile. Maybe they were descendants of miners who'd been trapped in cave-ins decades ago and had somehow adapted to life in the tunnels. The thought made my skin crawl. But it also gave me an idea. Using my knowledge of the local geography from all those pizza deliveries, I tried to remember where the main road was in relation to the mine entrances. If these tunnels connected to the old mining network, there might be passages that led toward the highway. I started crawling in what I hoped was the right direction, and Marcus followed behind me, both of us moving as quietly as possible while the creatures watched from the shadows. We crawled for what felt like miles through their tunnel system. The creatures followed us, staying just at the edge of our flashlight beam, but they never tried to stop us. Maybe they were just curious to see where we'd go, or maybe they understood we didn't belong down there. The clicking sounds continued all around us, but it felt more like conversation than threat. When we finally emerged from a storm drain near the main highway, we looked back to see dozens of pale faces watching us from the darkness of the pipe. They didn't follow us to the surface. Whatever they'd become, they belonged underground now. We ran back to my truck, grabbed our gear, and got out of Devil's Hollow as fast as we could drive. The local newspaper reported ground subsidence in the area a few days later, but they never mentioned what might have caused it. Just a story about old mine tunnels finally collapsing under their own weight. Marcus and I never talked about what we saw that night. He moved to North Carolina a few months later for a better construction job, and we lost touch. I still deliver pizzas to those mountain communities, and I drive past the turnoff to Devil's Hollow at least twice a week. But I never camp anywhere near old mining operations anymore. Sometimes, when I'm making a delivery up in coal country, I'll notice how quiet the woods are around the abandoned sites, or catch a whiff of that wet concrete smell on the wind. It makes me think about all those sealed mine entrances scattered across Appalachia, and what might be living in the dark spaces underneath our feet. Looking back now, I think we got lucky that night. Whatever those creatures were, they could have killed us easily if they'd wanted to. But they didn't. They were just trying to survive in a world that had forgotten they existed, deep underground where the old mountains keep their secrets. I still don't sleep well when it rains. Something about the sound of water dripping reminds me of those tunnels. And to this day, I've never told anyone the whole story except you. I'm 35 years old, and I manage a grocery store down in Richmond. Been doing it for 12 years now, which means I know the difference between what's fresh and what's gone bad. But I'd never seen plants that were somehow both at the same time until that trip to Whispering Ridge. My daughter Chloe was 18 and heading off to college in the fall. We'd never done much camping together. Her father used to handle all that outdoor stuff before the divorce. But with her leaving soon, I figured it was time for some real mother-daughter bonding. Plus, if I'm being honest, I wanted to prove to myself I could handle the wilderness just fine without my ex-husband. Chloe picked the location. She was taking this environmental science class and had been studying the unique forest ecosystem around Whispering Ridge in Virginia. The way she talked about it, these woods were special. Old-growth forest with trees that had been there for centuries. She kept going on about the biodiversity and how the soil composition created this perfect environment for plant life. I just nodded and agreed, happy to see her excited about something educational. We planned it for a long weekend in late spring. I took Friday off from work, and we loaded up my Honda with camping gear I'd borrowed from my sister. Chloe had this thick field guide for identifying trees and plants, and she was determined to catalog everything we saw. The drive up took about 3 hours, winding through increasingly dense forest until we reached the trailhead. The hike to our campsite was 6 miles, which doesn't sound like much, but carrying a full pack made it feel twice as long. I was determined not to slow Chloe down, though. She was in great shape from playing soccer, and I wasn't about to let my desk job make me look weak in front of my own daughter. We stopped every so often so she could identify different species: white oak, tulip poplar, American chestnut saplings that had somehow survived the blight. The whole time, I kept thinking about how lush everything looked. Growing up in suburban Richmond, I was used to manicured lawns and planned landscaping. But this forest was almost overwhelming in its greenness. Vines draped from every branch, moss covered every rock, and ferns carpeted the ground in thick, soft layers. It felt more like a jungle than the Virginia mountains. We found our campsite in a grove of massive old trees that Chloe estimated were over 300 years old. The trunks were so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't have wrapped around them. Their branches created this natural cathedral overhead, filtering the late afternoon sunlight into golden beams. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. Almost too beautiful, like something from a fairy tale. That first evening went perfectly. We set up our tent, made a fire, and spent hours going through Chloe's field guide. She was in her element, identifying bark patterns and leaf shapes, explaining the symbiotic relationships between different species. I felt proud watching her. My little girl had grown into this smart, passionate young woman who understood things I'd never even thought about. The forest seemed to settle around us as darkness fell. We heard the usual night sounds, owls hooting, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant sound of running water from a creek we'd crossed earlier. Everything felt normal and peaceful. We stayed up late, talking about her college plans, roasting marshmallows, just enjoying being together without the distractions of home. I slept better that night than I had in months. The second morning is when things started feeling off. I woke up early, around 6, and stepped outside to start the camp stove for coffee. That's when I noticed something that didn't make sense. The trees around our campsite had moved closer overnight. Now, I know how that sounds. Trees don't just pick up and relocate themselves. But I've been managing store layouts for over a decade, and I have a good eye for spatial relationships. When we'd set up camp the evening before, there had been a clear 20-foot radius around our tent. Now the tree line seemed maybe 15 feet away, and that massive oak I remembered being off to our left was now almost directly in front of our tent opening. When Chloe woke up, I mentioned it casually, not wanting to sound crazy. She laughed it off, said I was probably just disoriented from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. That made sense, so I let it go. But all morning, I kept glancing around, trying to convince myself I was remembering wrong. Around 10, while we were having breakfast, I started noticing the bark on the nearby trees. It looked wet, almost like it was sweating. When I pointed it out to Chloe, she said it was probably just morning dew or sap, but it didn't look like either of those things to me. It looked organic in a way that made my skin crawl, like the bark was pulsing slightly, as if something was moving underneath it. We decided to explore deeper into the forest after breakfast. Chloe wanted to document some of the rarer species she'd read about, and I was happy to follow along. The deeper we went, the more I noticed that unnatural lushness I'd observed the day before. Plants were growing in impossible tangles, vines twisted around tree trunks in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and everything was too green, too alive. Around noon, I started hearing the whispers. It began as just a sound I couldn't quite identify, like wind moving through leaves, but there wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. The sound seemed to come from above us, a soft rustling that almost sounded like voices having a conversation, just too quiet to understand. "Do you hear that?" I asked Chloe. She stopped walking and tilted her head. "Hear what?" "That whispering sound, like voices in the trees." She listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably just leaves rubbing together. These old trees make all kinds of sounds." But it didn't sound like leaves to me. It sounded like words in a language I couldn't recognize, spoken by voices that weren't quite human. The tone was conversational, almost friendly, like they were discussing something interesting they'd discovered. As the day went on, Chloe started acting strange. She'd walk up to trees and place her palms flat against the bark, standing there for long minutes with her eyes closed. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was feeling their energy and that these old trees had so much wisdom to share. This wasn't like my practical, science-minded daughter at all. She'd always been interested in environmental conservation, but in a data-driven way, soil samples and growth measurements, not mystical tree energy. When I tried to gently suggest we head back to camp, she insisted we stay longer because the trees were trying to tell her something important. That afternoon, while Chloe was documenting some rare flowering vines, I took a closer look at the trees she'd been touching. The bark felt wrong under my hands, warm and slightly sticky, like touching human skin. Some sections had what looked like natural patterns in the wood, but the longer I stared, the more they looked like faces. Peaceful human faces with closed eyes, mouths slightly open as if whispering secrets to the wind. I stepped back quickly and called for Chloe. When she joined me, I pointed out what I was seeing, but she just smiled and nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Aren't they beautiful?" she said, pressing her forehead against one of the face-like patterns. They've been here so long, watching everything, learning everything. That's when the tree opened its eyes. I'm not talking about bark patterns that looked like eyes. I mean actual human eyes, complete with pupils and irises, opened in what I'd thought was wood grain and looked directly at me. They were kind eyes, peaceful, but completely aware and intelligent. I grabbed Chloe's arm and tried to pull her away, but she resisted. "Don't be afraid, Mom," she said in a voice that didn't sound quite right. "They just want to share what they've learned." The tree's mouth opened, and it spoke in a voice I recognized, Chloe's voice, but from when she was about 5 years old. "Mommy, stay with us forever. We can all be a family here in the green place." More faces began emerging from the bark of surrounding trees. Dozens of them, men and women and children, all with that same peaceful expression. Their eyes opened, one by one, focusing on me with gentle curiosity. Some of them moved their mouths, whispering words I still couldn't understand, but their tone was welcoming, inviting. Chloe was changing. I noticed it first in her feet. Where she stood, tiny roots had begun growing from the soles of her boots into the forest floor. Her skin was taking on a greenish tint, and when she raised her arms, I saw small branches beginning to sprout from her wrists and forearms. "This is what I want, Mom," she said, though her voice was becoming more wind-like, less human. "I can join them, to become part of something bigger. I'll live forever here, learning everything the forest knows." The tree people whispered their agreement, their voices creating a gentle chorus that somehow made their offer sound reasonable. Why struggle with the difficulties of human life when you could become part of something eternal and wise? Why face the pain of separation and loss when you could be connected to everything forever? For just a moment, I felt the appeal of it. The peace in their faces was genuine. They weren't threatening or evil, they were offering what they saw as a gift. But they were offering to turn my daughter into something that wasn't human anymore. I thought about Chloe's college acceptance letter on our kitchen table, her plans to study forestry and conservation, her boyfriend Jake, who was planning to propose before graduation, her whole future as a human being, which these ancient tree people wanted to trade for their version of forever. The roots growing from her feet had thickened, anchoring her to the forest floor. Small flowers were beginning to bloom in her hair, and her skin was hardening into something bark-like. She was maybe halfway between human and plant, and I could see in her changing features that she was genuinely happy about the transformation. "I'm not losing you to this," I said, pulling out my car keys. The tree people's whispers turned sharp and angry as I used the metal to cut through the roots holding Chloe in place. The forest around us seemed to come alive, branches reaching out like grasping hands, vines trying to wrap around my legs, even the ground itself seeming to shift and grab at my feet. Chloe was only half conscious by then, her human thoughts fading as the plant parts of her took over. I had to carry her, and she was surprisingly light, as if part of her mass had already become something else. Small leaves sprouted from her shoulders as we moved, and her breath sounded like wind through branches. Getting back to our campsite felt like fighting through a living maze. The forest fought us every step of the way. Paths we'd walked earlier disappeared, familiar landmarks moved to different positions, and roots kept trying to trip me. But the closer we got to our tent and gear, the weaker the forest's hold seemed to become. By the time I loaded Chloe into the car, she was starting to look human again. The bark texture faded from her skin, the branches withdrew into her arms, and the roots crumbled away from her feet. She fell into a deep sleep that lasted the entire drive home, and when she woke up in her own bed the next morning, she didn't remember wanting to become a tree. She remembered the camping trip, remembered enjoying the forest and feeling connected to nature. But she didn't remember the transformation or the tree people. When I tried to tell her what had happened, she looked at me like I'd had some kind of breakdown. To her, we'd had a normal mother-daughter camping experience that ended early because I'd gotten spooked by the wilderness. That was 5 months ago. Chloe started college in the fall, majoring in forestry just like she'd planned. She's doing well, making friends, getting good grades, but sometimes when she calls home, I hear something different in her voice when she talks about her botany classes. She spends a lot of time alone in the campus arboretum, and her roommate mentions that she talks to the trees when she thinks no one can hear her. Last week, she sent me a picture from a field trip to some old-growth forest in North Carolina. In the background of the photo, I swear I can see faces in the bark of the ancient oaks behind her, and Chloe is standing just a little too close to one of them, her hand pressed against its trunk in a gesture that looks exactly like prayer. I don't know if part of my daughter never fully came back from Whispering Ridge, or if what happened there awakened something in her that was always meant to be. But I watch her carefully now, and I've made her promise to never go camping without me again, because I still remember carrying her down that mountain while flowers bloomed in her hair and her voice whispered secrets in a language older than words. And I know that somewhere in the forests of Virginia, the tree people are still waiting patiently for her to come home. I'm 29 years old and work as an auto mechanic here in eastern Tennessee. Been fixing cars for about 8 years now, and you learn to diagnose problems by sound, a rattling belt, a grinding brake pad, a transmission that's about to give up. But I'd never heard anything like what hunts around Bone Creek. My girlfriend Amy had this idea about primitive camping. Not your typical campground with bathrooms and fire pits, but real wilderness survival. Amy, just us, basic gear, and whatever skills we could manage. Amy works as a bank teller, but she'd been reading all these books about off-grid living, watching YouTube videos about homesteading. She wanted to test herself, see if she could actually handle life without modern conveniences. Honestly, I thought it was just a phase, but she was serious about it. I picked Bone Creek because my Uncle Danny used to hunt up there back in the 70s. He always said the game was plentiful, and more importantly, it was far enough from civilization that we wouldn't see another soul. The area sits about 15 miles northeast of where Highway 25 cuts through the Cherokee National Forest, accessible only by logging roads that haven't been maintained in decades, perfect for what Amy had in mind. We planned the trip for late September, when the weather would be cooler but not cold enough to kill us if something went wrong. Amy spent weeks preparing, studying edible plants, practicing fire-starting techniques, learning to read topographical maps. She bought this fancy survival manual and had the whole thing highlighted and bookmarked. Meanwhile, I just made sure our truck was in good shape for the rough roads and packed what I considered essential gear: a good knife, rope, basic first aid kit, and a water purification kit. Amy insisted we limit ourselves to one small backpack each. The hike into Bone Creek took us about 3 hours, following an old hunting trail that was barely visible in some places. We hiked 8 miles through thick forest, carrying only what we could manage on our backs: a 2-person tent, sleeping bags, minimal food for 3 days, some basic tools. The plan was to catch fish and forage for most of our meals. Amy had her plant identification books, and I'd brought fishing line and hooks. When we finally reached the creek, I had to admit Amy had picked a beautiful spot. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and there was a flat area about 30 yards from the bank that was perfect for our campsite. Tall oaks and maples created a canopy overhead, and the whole place felt peaceful, isolated, but in a good way. The kind of quiet you never get in town, where you can actually hear yourself think. That first day went exactly like Amy had hoped. We set up camp, and she immediately started identifying plants while I tested the water and looked for good fishing spots. The creek was full of small trout, and Amy found wild onions, some edible mushrooms she was confident about, and a patch of late blackberries. By evening, we had fresh fish cooking over a fire she'd started with flint and steel, feeling pretty proud of ourselves. Amy was in her element, constantly referencing her books and pointing out different plants, planning how we'd expand our primitive skills. She talked about maybe buying some land up in these mountains, building a small cabin, learning to be completely self-sufficient. I'll be honest, seeing her that happy made the whole trip worthwhile, even if I wasn't entirely sold on the off-grid lifestyle. We ate our simple meal as the sun went down, and Amy kept talking about how peaceful everything was, how this was what humans were meant to experience before we got caught up in the modern world. The fire crackled, the creek gurgled nearby, and everything felt right. For the first time in months, neither of us checked our phones or worried about work or bills or any of the usual stress. But that night, lying in our tent, listening to Amy breathe softly beside me, I heard something moving through the trees, something large. Heavy footsteps, but only when everything else was completely quiet. The strange thing was, it only moved in complete darkness. When the moon came out from behind clouds, or when I turned on my flashlight, all movement stopped immediately. At first, I figured it was just a deer or maybe a black bear passing through. But the movement pattern was wrong. It would stop and start, like whatever it was deliberately timing its movement to avoid being seen. Around 3 a.m., I heard sounds that made my stomach turn, wet tearing noises and what sounded like bones cracking. But when dawn came, and I searched around our campsite, there were no animal carcasses anywhere. The feeding sounds had come from directly above us, like something was eating in the tree canopy. But that didn't make sense either. What kind of animal feeds 40 feet up in the air on something large enough to make that much noise? Amy noticed I was quiet during breakfast, but I didn't want to worry her when we were having such a good time. She was already planning our next primitive camping trip, talking about trying it in winter, maybe inviting her sister. I just nodded and helped her gather more edible plants. But that afternoon, while Amy was down by the creek washing dishes, I found the claw marks. Deep gouges in the bark of several oak trees, at least 12 feet off the ground. Too big for any animal I knew of, and definitely fresh. The bark was white where it had been stripped away, and there was sap still bleeding from the wounds. Whatever made those marks had incredible reach or climbing ability, and based on the depth of the gouges, it was strong enough to tear through living wood like it was paper. I called Amy over to look, and she got excited in that way she does when she finds something interesting. She started taking pictures with her phone and measuring the marks with a stick. To her, this was just another cool wilderness discovery. To me, it felt like a warning. Maybe it's a really big bear, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. Or maybe there's something here that's not in my books yet. That's when we found the bone piles. About 100 yards from our campsite, arranged in perfect circles under a cluster of pine trees. Deer bones, rabbit bones, even tiny bird bones, all stripped completely clean and white. But they weren't scattered like normal predator kills. They were organized, arranged in patterns that looked almost ceremonial. Amy was fascinated. I was getting uncomfortable. But she convinced me to stay another night, said this was probably just how local predators marked their territory. She pointed out that nothing had actually threatened us, and we'd come this far to test our survival skills. The second night was when I realized we weren't alone out there, and whatever was watching us wasn't afraid of humans. The feeding sound started earlier, around midnight, and this time I could tell there were multiple creatures surrounding our campsite. They communicated with clicking sounds like insects, but much louder and more complex, like they were coordinating something. Amy whispered that she could see shapes moving between trees, but only when she wasn't looking directly at them. The moment she tried to focus on one spot, whatever was there would vanish. It was like they understood how human vision worked and deliberately stayed in our peripheral sight. I kept my flashlight ready, sweeping it across the tree line whenever the movement sounds got too close. Every time my light hit the forest, everything went silent. But the second I turned it off, the clicking and movement started again. Then something landed on our tent. The whole tent shook under the weight, and through the fabric, we could see a massive outline pressing down from above. It was testing the tent's strength, pressing down with what felt like claws, trying to figure out how to get inside. Amy grabbed my arm so hard I could feel her fingernails digging in, and we both held our breath, trying not to make any sound. I shined my flashlight straight up through the tent wall, and whatever was on top of us scattered immediately with sounds like wings beating. Not bird wings, something bigger, leathery, moving with too much coordination. Multiple creatures were in the trees above us, and I could hear them moving from branch to branch, circling our position. We stayed awake the rest of the night, taking turns with the flashlight, keeping the beam moving across the canopy. Every time the light passed over a particular spot, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Joints that bent the wrong way, limbs that were too long, shapes that looked almost human, but fundamentally wrong. By morning, our campsite was surrounded by a perfect circle of clean bones, arranged like markers or a boundary. The organization was too deliberate to be natural. These things had intelligence, and they were letting us know we were in their territory. Amy was terrified, but still trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. She kept saying we'd discovered something amazing, maybe a new species that science hadn't documented yet. But I was more concerned with keeping us alive than making biological discoveries. I realized these creatures were completely nocturnal. They couldn't or wouldn't hunt during daylight. That gave us options. Using my mechanic skills, I rigged our portable car battery to power LED light strips around our campsite perimeter. If light kept them away, we needed more light than just flashlights. We tested my theory that third night. The creatures circled just outside our lit area, clicking and calling to each other. But they wouldn't cross into the illuminated zone. Around midnight, one got brave and rushed toward us, but the moment it hit the light barrier, it scrambled back to darkness so fast, it was just a blur. But I saw enough in that brief moment to know we needed to leave immediately. It looked like someone had crossed a giant praying mantis with a bat, all joints and wings and 2 long limbs. The head was wrong, tilted at an angle that would break a normal spine. And the eyes reflected our lights like an animal's, but they were too large, too intelligent, too focused. We kept the lights running all night and packed up at first dawn, while they retreated to wherever they slept during the day. Amy was quiet on the hike out, and by the time we reached the truck, she'd decided off-grid living wasn't for her after all. I still go camping, but never without multiple flashlights and a generator. Some mechanical solutions are more important than others. And sometimes when I'm working late at the shop, alone with just the sound of my tools, I remember those clicking sounds from Bone Creek, and I make sure all the bay lights are on. Amy and I broke up about 6 months later. Not because of what happened up there, exactly, but because it changed how we saw the world. She wanted to pretend it never happened, go back to normal life. I couldn't forget that there are things in those mountains that are older and smarter than we want to believe. To this day, if I'm driving through the Cherokee National Forest and I see that turnoff for the old logging roads, I keep driving. Some places are better left alone, especially after dark.